I was 34 years old the day my brother got married, and my entire family finally saw me as someone other than the screw-up grocery store girl they had decided I was, and even now, telling you this, my hands still remember the feel of that mustard-yellow bridesmaid dress scratching against my skin in the Fairmont hotel room, while my mother's voice poured through the phone the way it always had. Equal parts concern, performance, and quiet judgment, like she was reading lines from a script she'd practiced my whole life. Emma, sweetheart, remember to dress appropriately? Smile and please just try not to embarrass the family today, she said. And I remember looking at myself in the mirror, at the woman with the dark hair and a low bun, light makeup circles under her eyes that even concealer couldn't fully hide, and thinking, it's funny how you can build a multi-billion-dollar company and still be reduced to a child in a single phone call, because that was who I was to them. The difficult daughter, the one who never measured up to Marcus, the golden boy, the one they pitied, managed, and explained away whenever anyone asked what I did for a living. I'll do my best not to ruin Marcus's big day with my existence. I told her, my voice lighter than I felt, tugging at the zipper of the bridesmaid dress that made me look like a bruised banana, and Mom laughed in that nervous way she does when she isn't sure if I'm being sarcastic, then slipped into the topic that always came next. And Emma, if anyone asks about your job situation, just keep it simple. Okay, honey, it's Marcus's day. We don't need people feeling awkward. My job situation. That's what she called it now, like it was a chronic illness instead of the thing that had taken every ounce of my 20s and early 30s. The thing that had cost me birthdays, relationships, sleep, and any illusion that success would magically fix loneliness. And I remember staring at the city skyline outside my window, thinking how insane it was that 3 days from that moment I'd be signing off on a $1.8 billion acquisition of a major Asian logistics conglomerate. And yet in my mother's mind, I was still her struggling daughter, who worked down at the grocery store, still someone she quietly sent imaginary rent money to when she told people how our family took care of its own. I should probably tell you right away that I am a woman, obviously, and that I didn't grow up poor. Not in the way people mean when they say that word on TV. We were a middle-class family in Portland, Oregon, with a mortgage, 2 cars that mostly worked, and parents who believed in appearances, the way some people believe in God. And from the moment I can remember, we were all orbiting Marcus, my older brother, by 2 years. The brilliant one, the future lawyer, the boy whose spelling bees and soccer trophies lined our hallway, while my participation ribbons curled at the edges in a box under my bed. I was the quiet kid, the one who loved numbers and patterns and watched delivery trucks more than cartoons, the one teachers described as bright, but distracted, which my mother translated into not quite like other kids in a tone that wasn't a compliment. And it's strange how small phrases can become scars when they're repeated enough. How not quite like other kids slowly turned into Emma's always been a little behind. Then, Emma means well, but she doesn't quite get things until eventually your own family feels comfortable speculating about whether you have an undiagnosed learning disability while you're still in the next room. I can trace the beginning of my unresolved anger back to one particular afternoon when I was 17, sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of college brochures spread out in front of me. My heart pounding because I'd just gotten a partial scholarship offer from a state university with a strong business program, and I'd spent weeks secretly building a plan around that acceptance. A plan that involved double majoring in operations and computer science, maybe moving to Seattle afterward, maybe doing something in logistics. That strange, beautiful word I'd fallen in love with after I'd stumbled into a warehouse tour for a school field trip and watched pallets move like choreography across a concrete floor. I'd been explaining the scholarship letter to my parents, my voice shaking when my father, without even looking up from his paperwork, said, "That's nice, Em, but your brother's law school tuition is going to stretch us as it is." And my mother chimed in smoothly, "Yes, sweetheart, we just don't have the resources for you to wander around trying to figure things out. At some big university community college is more appropriate for your strengths." I remember that pause, the way she swallowed the word limitations and replaced it like I wouldn't hear the missing syllables. And then I remember the quiet slide of the college fund statement across the table as my father explained that they'd used most of our savings to cover Marcus's LSAT prep and deposit, that it was only fair since he had a concrete plan and I was still finding myself, and the message was clear: the family's investment had a hierarchy and I wasn't on top of it. I went to community college for a year, working nights at a local diner, and that might have been the end of the story in some other version of my life, the one where I accepted that I was second tier and stopped asking for more. But anger is a powerful kind of fuel when you don't let it calcify into self-pity. I started reading every free article I could find about supply chains and inventory management. I eavesdropped on conversations in the loading dock behind the diner. I took a summer job at a small warehouse just to watch how goods moved. And I realized something that changed everything. The entire world was built on systems nobody really saw invisible. Rivers of products and data and timing that connected farms to shelves, factories to homes, and most people treated that like background noise, but to me it felt like a map, like a language I could actually read, and I became obsessed with learning how to speak it fluently. At 21, I moved to Seattle with a duffel bag, a beat-up Corolla, and enough savings to cover 1 month of rent in a studio that smelled like damp carpet, and I got a job at Safeway as a night shift cashier because I couldn't afford to wait for something better, and because I needed to be inside the system I wanted to change. My family's version of that move, of course, is that I ran off to work at a grocery store because I couldn't handle school, which is not entirely wrong, but not for the reasons they think. And over those years, the story hardened into something they repeated at holidays, like a funny anecdote about their black sheep daughter who never quite launched. What they never saw were the 3 a.m. hours when my body ached from lifting boxes, but my mind was on fire when I'd watch the flow of inventory from the back room to the shelves, noting which items got restocked fastest, which promotional displays actually moved product, which bottlenecks made people wait just long enough to abandon their carts. And I started sketching out ideas in a beat-up notebook, crude diagrams of how data could better predict demand, how refrigerated transport could be optimized, so produce didn't spend unnecessary hours warming up on docks, how we could reduce waste and increase margins at the same time. I'd come home as the sun was rising, nap for a few hours, then drag myself to the library, where I taught myself basic coding and ran simulations on public datasets, experimenting with algorithms that could reschedule trucks and restock shelves in a more intelligent way. And somewhere in the middle of those blurry months, Anderson Global Logistics was born, not as a formal company, just as a name I wrote at the top of my notebook one night when I realized I wasn't just daydreaming anymore, I was building. I wish I could tell you there was one big lucky break, a Hollywood montage of success, but the truth is uglier and lonelier. I was rejected by every bank I approached, laughed out of more than one pitch meeting, told to come back with a male co-founder if I wanted to be taken seriously. And I kept going because the alternative was going back to being the girl whose college fund was better used on her brother's dreams, and I couldn't live with that. Not again, so I pieced it together with smaller wins. A local chain of organic grocery stores let me run a pilot on one region. A software investor took a chance on my routing algorithm after seeing the actual fuel savings data. A large food distributor agreed to test my system in their least profitable territory, and slowly, painfully, the numbers started to prove what I'd known instinctively: the way we moved food was broken and I could fix it. 7 years after I'd first clocked in for that night shift at Safeway, Anderson Global Logistics had warehouses in multiple states, a proprietary software platform, a growing team, and a contract pipeline that made my investors giddy. I moved from barely paying rent to signing leases on industrial properties, from repairing my car with duct tape and hope to negotiating fleet deals. And during that entire time, my family's understanding of my life froze in place, like a photograph they refused to update. Whenever they called, which wasn't often, they'd ask half-heartedly how the grocery job was going, and if I mentioned expansion or hiring, they'd interpret it as me moving to a new store or becoming a shift supervisor, and eventually I made a choice that I'm still not sure was wise or petty or just necessary. I stopped correcting them. In the beginning, it was because I was tired, because every attempt to explain what I did was met with confused nods and dismissive jokes. I remember one Thanksgiving early on when I tried to tell my uncle about a routing optimization we'd deployed that had cut delivery times by 12% across an entire region, and before I could even finish, he patted my hand and said, "Well, it's good you're ambitious about your little grocery store job. Emma, some people are content just scanning barcodes," and the table laughed lightly, including my mother, who quickly shifted the conversation to Marcus's latest law firm promotion. That night, I decided I'd let them live with their version of me, the one they could understand, and it became almost an experiment watching how they'd shape their assumptions around whatever small details they overheard, turning "I'm in food retail logistics" into "Emma works at a grocery store and hasn't moved up in years." But as Anderson Global became bigger, as we expanded into cold chain logistics for pharmaceuticals and signed deals with companies I'd grown up seeing in commercials, the gap between who I was and who my family thought I was stretched into something that hurt, something that felt like a quiet betrayal layered over the old ones. Because it wasn't just ignorance anymore, it was willful. If you're listening to this, I want you to understand this part, because maybe you've lived it to that moment when you've changed so much. But the people who raised you refuse to update their picture, and every time you walk into a family gathering, you're dragged backward into a version of yourself that no longer exists, until eventually the visit itself feels like an act of self-harm. So when Marcus got engaged to Patricia, a polished attorney from a family of judges and entrepreneurs, and my mother called me half breathless with excitement, half cautious, because she didn't want me to say anything weird around Patricia's parents, I agreed to be a bridesmaid and booked my flight from Seattle to San Francisco, telling myself it was just a weekend, that I could endure anything for 48 hours, that it might even be funny in a dark way to be surrounded by people who had no idea that the woman they pitied was the same one quietly managing supply chains for some of their favorite brands. It wasn't funny. The rehearsal dinner the night before the wedding felt like being dissected under warm lighting and expensive wine. Patricia's family were exactly the kind of high achievers my parents worshipped her father. A self-made construction magnate, her mother a federal judge, her brother a tech founder who had just sold his startup for $50 million. And you could feel the joy in the room when they talked about Marcus joining that lineage, becoming part of a family of substance, their words, not mine. And I watched my parents soak that in shoulders, straighter eyes, brighter. Like his marriage to Patricia retroactively justified all the sacrifices they'd made for him, every dollar pulled from my future to invest in his. During cocktails, Patricia's brother Jason approached me friendly, genuinely curious, and asked what I did. Before I could speak, Marcus slid in with a chuckle and said, "Emma's not really the entrepreneurial type, she works at a grocery store, but hey, it's honest work." And I remember swallowing the burn in my chest as Jason's expression flickered from interest to slightly pained politeness, the way people look when they're trying very hard to be kind. And I said something like, "Food retail is more complex than people think, the logistics alone." Before Patricia's father, ever the conversationalist, redirected the discussion back to Marcus's law practice. Later that night, I passed by the hotel bar on my way up to my room and overheard Patricia's mother talking to mine. Her voice pitched low. "So Emma is the one who works at the grocery store." And my mother sighed dramatically. This practiced, resigned sound I recognized all too well. "Yes, poor thing, she's still trying to find her way, but we help when we can. You know how it is. Not everyone can be as successful as our Marcus and the other woman." A judge, whose job was literally to evaluate truth, nodded with what she probably thought was compassion and said, "Well, every family has one. At least she seems sweet, and I don't know why that particular phrase. Every family has one hit me so hard." But I went back to my room, closed the door, and sat on the floor with my back against the bed, staring at the wall while my laptop hummed on the desk, where I'd been reviewing the final draft of the Chin Industries merger documents, and I felt that old teenage ache again, the one that tasted like helplessness and fury, and bone-deep exhaustion. You'd think with the money, the power, the Forbes list placing me among the richest self-made women in America that I'd be immune by now. But trauma doesn't check your bank account before it decides whether to fire up all its old pathways. When the people who first taught you who you are keep insisting you're small, unremarkable, and almost embarrassment, there's a part of you that never fully stops believing them, no matter how high you climb. The morning of the wedding, Mom's call was just the opening act. In the bridal suite, while makeup artists fluttered around us, the other bridesmaids compared resumes and vacations. One talking about saving premature babies as a pediatric surgeon, another discussing her second startup's seed round, a third casually mentioning her partnership track at a consulting firm. And when they got to me, Patricia smiled that bright, oblivious smile and said, "Emma's been in grocery for years, it's very stable." And the surgeon nodded kindly and said, "Stability is important, especially these days." And I smiled and agreed, because the alternative was to stand up and say, "Actually, I employ 85,000 people across 47 countries and handle distribution for about 30% of the Fortune 500. But sure, let's talk about stability." And I knew if I did that, my mother would call it showing off. Marcus would accuse me of trying to steal his thunder. And the story they'd tell afterward would be about how embarrassing it was that I made my brother's wedding all about my delusions. I want you to understand, I wasn't hiding what I'd built because I was ashamed of it. I was hiding it because I was tired of battling the narrative my family clung to. Tired of being told that my reality was arrogance, that my achievements were fantasy, that my language was too technical or too much. And sometimes invisibility feels safer than constantly defending your right to exist as you are. But safety and self-respect don't always coexist. And that day as speeches dragged on through dinner in the grand ballroom, I felt something inside me start to splinter. Marcus toasted Patricia's family at length, praising their drive and success, then turned to ours and made a point of highlighting our uncle's partnership at an accounting firm, our cousin's dental practices, my parents' decades of hard work. And then when his gaze landed on me, he said, "And, of course, my sister Emma, who kindly took time off from her job in food service to be here tonight. Despite the expense, she reminds us that there's dignity in simple work, and that not everyone needs to chase big dreams to be happy." And the room applauded in that way people do when they're proud of their own tolerance, and something about the phrase simple work, and the implication that my life was small enough to be squeezed into that little moral lesson made my vision blur for a second. I excused myself a little later, walking out onto the terrace to breathe air that didn't smell like champagne and condescension, and that's when Karma decided to pull her chair up to the table. Voices drifted from around the corner, low and familiar. Patricia's mother was speaking to Marcus, her tone serious. "I just want to make sure about Emma. Dear, if Patricia wants her as future godmother to the children, I have some concerns about the example you said she's been struggling for years. And Marcus, my brother, the boy whose college I'd unknowingly funded by losing my own, laughed and said Mom's soft on her, but Emma's basically our family charity case. At this point, she's been at that same grocery job for 7 years. No advancement, nothing. We help her with bills when we can. I wouldn't trust her with any major responsibility, but she's sweet. There was a pause. Then he added casually, honestly, I think she might have some mild learning issue that was never diagnosed, but we don't say that, of course, and I felt my stomach drop. Because hearing your private family myth about your supposed incompetence repeated to strangers as fact is a particular kind of humiliation, the kind that reaches back into every time you were talked over or dismissed and stitches them together into a neat, suffocating blanket. I stood there invisible while they discussed my alleged food stamps, my 15-year-old car, my limited potential like I was a case study in failure, and by the time they moved back inside, I was shaking not just from anger but from something deeper, from the realization that my silence had not protected me, it had simply given them room to invent a worse story. I pulled out my phone with hands that weren't quite steady and texted David, my head of security in Seattle, the man whose life I'd changed when I'd hired him after he'd aged out of the Secret Service and needed a civilian job where his skills mattered. Ready for extraction? I typed half-jokingly, though the joke tasted bitter, and he responded almost immediately. Helicopter field 10 minutes out, say the word, because that's what my life looked like outside this hotel. I had a team, I had resources, I had options, and yet inside those ballroom doors I was still just Emma, the girl who needed help with rent. I was planning to slip out quietly when Marcus tapped his champagne glass, calling the room to attention for one more toast, and what happened next felt so bizarrely cinematic that if I hadn't lived it, I might think someone was embellishing, but I promise you, I am not. He started with the usual platitudes, thanking guests for traveling, praising Patricia's grace and intelligence, basking in her parents' reflected glow. And then, almost inevitably, his gaze swung my way again, because apparently, I was a useful prop for his speech, a contrast color that made everyone else's achievements pop. In a room full of doctors and entrepreneurs and legal minds, he said, it's also important to remember the value of simple, honest work. My sister Emma has been working in food service for years, showing up doing what needs to be done even when it isn't glamorous. And that is its own kind of success. There it was. Again, simple, honest. The words that sound like praise, but land like a pat on the head. And faces turned toward me with that blend of pity and approval that makes you want to scream. And that's when a tall man in an impeccable black suit appeared at my elbow, as if summoned by the weight of my restraint, finally snapping, Miss Anderson, he said quietly. But his voice carried more than he realized, the room going a little still. I apologize for the interruption, but we have a situation regarding the Chin Industries merger. The Singapore team is on the line. Tokyo markets open in 3 hours. They need your final decision on the $1.8 billion acquisition. The helicopter is ready on the roof when you are. Time did that stretchy, strange thing it does in shock. Marcus's champagne glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the marble. Patricia's fork froze midway to her mouth. My mother's face drained of color so fast, I thought she might faint, and half the room turned to look at David, then back at me, then at each other, trying to piece together how the girl from the grocery store had a head of security talking about helicopters and billion-dollar deals. I could have stayed quiet, let David shepherd me out in a cloud of confusion, but something in me, that 17-year-old at the kitchen table, the 21-year-old on the Safeway night shift, the 34-year-old woman who had let herself be made small to keep the peace, all of them rose up at once and refused to be ghosted out of this story. Not again. Not tonight. I stood slowly smoothing the awful mustard dress. And for a moment, I just looked around the room at my uncle, with his half-mocking smile wiped clean at my cousins, who had spent years talking about my poor life choices, at Patricia's family-cultured faces, now open with genuine curiosity, and at my parents, my mother's hand gripping the back of her chair, my father's jaw clenched, and then I heard my own voice steady in a way my heartbeat definitely wasn't. Say, I suppose this is as good a time as any to clear up a little misunderstanding about what I actually do. You could have heard a fork drop. My name is Emma Anderson, I continued. I am the founder and CEO of Anderson Global Logistics. We manage supply chains and distribution for roughly 30% of the Fortune 500, specialize in cold chain logistics for pharmaceutical companies, and operate in 47 countries. Our annual revenue last year was $4.2 billion. We employ 85,000 people, and in 3 days, assuming I don't miss this call, we are closing a $1.8 billion acquisition that will double our footprint in Asia. I watched those facts ripple through them like cold water, saw phones come out under the table as people silently typed my name into search bars, saw my cousin's face go slack when he found the Forbes article listing me among the top self-made women in America, my net worth estimated at $2.3 billion, and I can't lie, there was a grim, fierce satisfaction in that moment in seeing their certainty crumble. The grocery store job Marcus mentioned, I said, and my voice did shake a little now. Not from nerves, but from decades of swallowed words coming uncorked was real. I worked nights at Safeway for 3 years while I built my first warehouse during the day. I stocked shelves and scanned barcodes and mopped floors. Not because I couldn't do more, but because I wanted to understand every aspect of the system I planned to disrupt. Most executives learn from consultants. I learned by hauling pallets and freezing in walk-in coolers, and I am not ashamed of that. That work taught me everything. I turned to Marcus, then watched him flail for an explanation. Why didn't you tell us, he demanded, as if this were somehow my deceit? Why would you let us think you were barely getting by? And before I could answer, one of my younger cousins blurted out louder than she meant to. Aunt Linda, you showed me that article about Emma last year. Remember? You said it was funny how much that CEO looked like her, and the room shifted the way a ship does when a new weight is thrown to the other side. Because suddenly the betrayal wasn't just their assumptions, it was the fact that my mother had apparently known, or at least suspected and chosen to say nothing, to let the narrative of me as their shameful underachiever continue, because it served some emotional function for her. Maybe made her feel like she was still in control of my life, still superior to me in some way. Her face crumpled, rage and embarrassment and fear all warring behind her eyes. I didn't know for sure, she snapped. It could have been some other Emma Anderson. You know how the internet exaggerates? And what was I supposed to do? March in here and tell everyone? My daughter is some big shot? Make a fool of myself if it wasn't true? And under that defensive bluster, I heard the real confession. She had seen evidence that I was not the failure she'd built her identity around, and she'd refused to entertain it because it threatened the role she'd carved out for herself as the long-suffering mother of the difficult child. You were supposed to ask me, I said quietly, feeling something inside me finally blessedly snapping in the right direction. You were supposed to pick up the phone and say, Emma, is this you? You were supposed to give me the chance to tell you my story, instead of repeating one you wrote without my consent. My father cleared his throat grim. You always made your work sound so vague. How were we to know? And I laughed then, not because it was funny, but because the alternative was screaming. I used the words supply chain management and logistics. Every time we spoke, I said I talked about hiring staff and opening facilities and traveling to negotiate contracts, and you chose, all of you, to translate that into she works at a grocery store. Because that version of me fit better with the narrative where Marcus was the great success, and I was the cautionary tale. It comforted you to believe I'd squandered my potential, instead of admitting you might have misjudged me all along. Around the room, I saw other layers of realization land. My uncle remembering every condescending pep talk, my cousin recalling the time she'd joked about me using food stamps while I was quietly funding a scholarship program for warehouse workers' kids. Michael from Patricia's side whispering to someone. Our firm tried to get a meeting with Anderson Global last year. They were booked solid for months. And in the middle of it all, Marcus stood there red-faced, looking less like the groom and more like a little boy whose toy had been taken away. So what you think you're better than us now? He spat, the hurt in his voice twisting into accusation. You think money makes you superior? I took a breath, feeling my pulse finally slow enough to steady my words. No, Marcus, what? I think is that you don't actually know me. None of you do, because you never bothered to ask questions that might force you to redraw the lines you're comfortable with, and I'm tired. I'm tired of shrinking myself so you don't have to feel insecure. Tired of letting you build your sense of generosity and competence around this idea that you help me when the truth is, I have quietly bailed you out more times than you know. Gasps, murmurs one of Patricia's cousins, muttering, What? And I looked directly at my father. Remember when Marcus's bar exam prep course got canceled because the private lender backed out? The anonymous investor who stepped in with a low-interest loan, the one you toasted publicly at that family barbecue. That was me. I set up the LLC that wired the funds. I did it because I love my brother, because I didn't want him to lose his shot, the way I did when you drained my college fund for his tuition, and I did it without asking for credit, and somehow you still managed to paint me as the family burden. My father opened his mouth, then closed it again. Their tidy myth unraveling thread by thread, and I realized then that this was the shocking family secret I'd been carrying for years, without fully admitting its weight even to myself. I had not just succeeded, in spite of them, I had quietly underwritten the very future they'd prioritized over mine. The room was suffocating, full of eyes and old stories, and the clink of silverware no one was touching anymore, and behind me I felt David's presence solid and calm. A reminder that I had somewhere else to be, another life waiting that did not require me to win this argument to be real. Ms. Anderson, he said softly, Singapore is holding, and the pilot reports we are wheels up in 11 minutes if we want to hit the window, and his words, so matter of fact, in contrast to the chaos of my family's emotions, grounded me. I looked at Marcus, at Patricia, her face a mask of hurt and confusion, at her parents who, despite everything, seemed more intrigued than judgmental, now reassessing the narrative they'd been fed about the girl in the mustard dress. And I realized I didn't owe them more explains in that moment. Not if the cost was bleeding out in front of people who had never offered me a bandage. I'm truly happy for you. I told Marcus, and I meant it beneath everything I did because his happiness and my pain were not as tied together as my parents had always implied. And I hope your marriage is built on seeing each other clearly and not on comforting lies, because those have a way of exploding. Eventually, take it from someone who's lived on the receiving end of them her whole life. I turned to my parents softer now, because anger with them was layered over love that refused to die. I can't control what story you tell about me to your friends, but I can control how close I stand to you while you tell it, and for my own sanity, that distance is going to change. And I watched the meaning of that sink in, the realization that their access to me, to my time, to the quiet safety net I'd been, was no longer something they could take for granted. Then I walked out, not dramatically, not flouncing, just putting one foot in front of the other, every step away from that ballroom, feeling like I was leaving a version of myself there, the one they'd misnamed and mishandled. And when the elevator doors closed, it was like a chapter finally clicking shut. On the rooftop, the wind whipped at my hair as the helicopter's blades spun faster, and David helped me climb in with the ease of someone who had done it 100 times. "How did it go?" he asked through the headset. Once the doors were closed and the roar of the engine wrapped around us, and I let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Messy," I said, watching the hotel shrink beneath us as we lifted off tiny figures gathering on the terrace below to stare up at the aircraft whisking away the relative they'd underestimated but necessary, I think. As the city lights spread out under us, the grid of streets and ports and warehouses, I knew so intimately it felt like a second map of my own nervous system. I thought about the girl I had been, the one who believed that if she'd just achieved enough, her family would have to love her correctly, would have to apologize, would have to see her. And I realized somewhere between the Fairmont roof and my office tower that this was the real revenge, not the public reveal, or the stunned expressions, or the whispered gossip that would ripple through both families for months, but the quiet decision to stop waiting for their validation, to stop building my life as a rebuttal to their low expectations, and instead to live it as a reflection of my own values, my own sense of worth. The Singapore call went well, by the way. We negotiated until 2 in the morning, ironing out liabilities and transitional clauses. And when the deal was finally locked, my team cheered across 3 time zones, screens full of faces who knew me only as their boss, their partner, their sometimes terrifying but always fair CEO, and later alone in my office with the city dark outside, I opened my phone to a flood of messages from my family, some angry, some stunned, a few heartbreakingly apologetic, and I didn't answer any of them that night, because for once I wasn't going to rush in and soothe their discomfort at the cost of my own peace. In the days and weeks that followed, the story of my exit from the wedding became its own kind of legend, passed around in half-truths and exaggerated details. Did you hear Marcus's sister is some logistics mogul who left his reception in a helicopter for $1 billion merger? People would say, and strangers on the internet would argue in comment sections about whether it was real or just a viral story someone made up, and I watched parts of it play out, sometimes amused, sometimes tired, but mostly detached, because I knew the real story was smaller and bigger than that. A lifetime of being underestimated, boiling over in a single evening, where I finally chose myself. Eventually, after some space and more than one therapy session, I did accept a call from my mother. She cried, of course told me she was proud in a halting, uncertain way, tried to explain that they'd only downplayed my achievements because they didn't understand them, because bragging felt wrong, because they were afraid if they believed in me and I failed, it would hurt worse. And none of those reasons truly excused what they'd done, but they were human, flawed, and scared and stuck in their own stories, and I had to decide whether my revenge was going to be permanent exile or something more complicated, something that looked like boundaries and cautious forgiveness rather than scorched earth. I won't pretend we wrapped everything up in a neat bow. There are still moments when my mother slips into old patterns, when a cousin makes a thoughtless joke, when I feel the urge to shrink or shout, but those moments no longer define me, and that is the difference, that is the karma. I chose the one where I break the cycle not by erasing people, but by refusing to erase myself. So if you're watching this and any part of my story feels uncomfortably familiar, if you've ever sat at a table where people who should have loved you spoke about you like you weren't in the room, if you've built something they refuse to see because it doesn't match the version of you they prefer, I want you to hear me clearly. Your worth is not measured by their imagination. Your success is not real only when they finally recognize it, and you do not owe anyone a smaller, more palatable version of yourself so that they can stay comfortable in their old stories. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply living your life fully honestly and loudly enough that their narrative stops being the main one in your head. And sometimes karma isn't a dramatic downfall for them, but a quiet rising for you. A choice to step into rooms where you are seen and step out of those where you are only ever the punchline. If my story resonates with you, if it makes you feel a little less alone in your own family drama, or reminds you that you're allowed to grow beyond the role you were assigned, It would mean a lot to me if you'd like this video. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future stories, and leave a comment telling me about a time you were underestimated and what you did with that pain. Because your voice matters here. And sometimes the first step in rewriting your life is just speaking it out loud to someone who finally listens.